I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs. We help leaders, organizations, and teams adapt to the new ways of work in the emerging post-pandemic world. That's a mouthful. In addition to all the great work that the team does with our clients, we produce this live weekly video series called Centaur Stage. Every Thursday afternoon, 2:30 p.m. UAE time, myself and some incredible guests explore bold ideas about the future of work and learning. And since we're on the topic of live events, I also wanted to let everyone know that later today, we're co-hosting a webinar with Spengler Fox, a global talent consultancy on organizational resilience. We'll explore how to lead during a prolonged crisis and how to develop resilient organizations. We'll add the link in the comments. Please do register and join us 5 p.m. today. That's in about 2.5 hours. We'd love to see you there. And one last thing before we begin, just a reminder, give this video a like. Feel free to contribute and ask questions. I know so many of you are excited about this episode. Tala, our producer, will be on the lookout for those, and we're hoping Andrew will have some time to answer a few. Today, we're hosting a guest who I met remotely and with whom we've had many conversations about our shared passions and distributed work. Andrew is the founder of Remote AF, the world's first framework for effective remote working. He's also the founder of Elaborate, Australia's leading lean and agile consultancy that aims to help its customers deliver exceptional products and services and drive positive cultural change through the adoption of lean and agile. He's an experienced technology leader with expertise in strategy, organizational design, complex facilitation, and adaptive leadership. Andrew is also our first guest from Down Under. Good day, Andrew.
How you going, Marilyn? I think I've already failed. For those who weren't here before we started, Marilyn told me to look pretty during the intro, and yeah, that's not my specialty. So I hope it was okay. It can only go up. Yeah.
Everybody has appreciated how pretty you looked in those 2 minutes. Andrew, before we start, maybe you want to let everyone know what Remote AF stands for. I know there could be a bit of a confusion around that name.
Yeah, sure. We originally called it the Remote Agility Framework, but over time it kind of morphed into Remote as Fuck. So we kind of say it's Remote Agility Framework in polite settings, but you can call it what you want when you're working in teams. But yeah, basically it's a framework that's built on a decade or more of working with some of Australia's biggest companies and some of our more forward-thinking organisations as well. So we've learned a lot. We've failed a lot as well as succeeding occasionally, and we've tried to sort of build that into the framework.
Yeah, I did think it was remote as fuck the first time I read it, so guilty as charged. Andrew, you and I are going to be talking about the interconnection of remote and agile. And while I'm pretty sure we don't need to explain what remote is, I wanted to just open a session with a definition of what agile means, just in case some of our audience members, would like a refresher on that. And in software development, agile practices involve discovering requirements and developing solutions through collaborative effort of self-organizing and cross-functional teams together with their customers and users. Agile methodologies advocate adaptive planning, evolutionary development, early delivery, and continuous improvement, and encourages a more flexible response to change. It was, of course, popularized by the Manifesto for Agile Software Development written in 2001. And since we're going to be exploring the interconnection of agile and remote, I wanted to kind of take us back maybe to a starting point that may be a bit controversial, but the agile purists always refer to one of the manifesto's 12 principles, which says the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversations. And yet software development teams are amongst the first to have adopted remote work. What are your thoughts on that?
Yep. So, look, I believe that principle is best captured. I think it was Scott Ambler and Alistair Coburn did a paper. Be going back a bit, and one of the things that was in that paper was like a description of the richness of communication that you get via different channels, and basically it went through from sort of paper-based communication to email-based communication to other forms of communication, and talked about how effective and I think rich those forms of communication were as you go through. And obviously the most effective way and the richest form of communication is face-to-face. We do have a fair bit of research. There's more research coming out now. I think there was a paper published quite recently that talked about the impact of Zoom fatigue, and I think there was a historical one and one that came out very recently that kind of says that this method of communicating is actually quite cognitively challenging because we're missing feedback loops. So we cannot get away from the fact that face-to-face is the easiest way to communicate. And if you've got a whiteboard and you're drawing and you're sharing and that kind of thing, then you can be that form of communication is the most synchronous. It's the most opportunities for feedback loops. You've got all the natural feedback that you get, the oral feedback, the sense of smell, all the things that are important to us as humans. So we can't get away from that. But what we have found with remote teams, there's definitely some benefits that to communicating in different ways. Primarily things like digital whiteboards. We've found over the last sort of 4 or 5 years working with digital whiteboards that there's some genuine benefits to digital whiteboards over the physical ones. For instance, one of those is that introverts really come to the fore. So in a room where you've got lots of egos, big voices, highest paid person's opinion, or the hippo, whatever you can call it, all that sort of stuff happening, you'll often find that good ideas are drowned out by the more energetic and happy to put their opinion forward people in the room. When we're on digital whiteboards, we're finding that introverts really do actually come to the fore and have a lot louder voice. And one of the really cool things you can do with digital whiteboards is true silent facilitation, where no one knows who's putting ideas up. And it is truly an idea meritocracy because there's no name attached to what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good point. I mean, what you're saying is, yes, of course, we all know that face-to-face is the best way to communicate. But if we just look at the spectrum and try to figure out what each tool now enables rather than what it takes away from us, then maybe we can really create sort of an ecosystem of tools that works for us. And so tell me about the elements of agile practices that you think are quite appropriate in approaching remote work.
Yeah, I might go back a little bit in history to answer that question. So I think that the gents who, and it was a group of men, it's a little bit controversial these days that there wasn't a bit more gender diversity in that group, but a bunch of guys got together and had a meeting up in Snowbird in Utah on the slopes, and we're looking at ways to do software better based on different frameworks that had emerged over sort of the 10, 15 years before that. So there were things like DSDM and Scrum and extreme programming and like a range of different methods. My belief is that those methods emerged due to matrix-based management. So we moved into these organizational structures where you had functional silos, and then you'd bring project managers in to orchestrate work across the functional silos of your organization. So I'd take someone from here, someone from here, someone from here. I'd work out the phases that I needed. I'd put people into the project phases, and then we sort of move work through phases. And with each change of team as you went through that process, you lost fidelity and knowledge, and basically things kind of, the knowledge that was gained during the process would be lost and would have to be rediscovered again. So that to me is why we kind of started embracing Agile frameworks and the Agile manifesto quite, it really spoke to a lot of IT people. Building software or building technology products is a problem solving or a knowledge discovery process. It's not a mechanical process. And we'd gotten into the habit of trying to use techniques that were really great for building skyscrapers or for doing construction projects or for rolling out a telecom. they were just completely not fit for purpose for what we were doing. In terms of what really fits for remote, small cross-functional teams that have a clear idea of what they need to achieve and can achieve that in a largely autonomous fashion is the ideal for remote working. When you've got that, it's really easy to do remote work. When you're trying to work across lots of organizational silos and stitch things together and orchestrate and manage up the org chart and do all the stuff that you need to do to get stuff through a system, it's actually quite hard.
So do you think that companies that, are really considering remote work as a long-term work model beyond the pandemic need to reorganize?
Yeah, I'll answer that in two parts. So yes, I do, but I think that remote presents a whole heap of new and interesting constraints that we didn't. They're different to the constraints that you have in a physical environment. So if you think about your normal design process, one of the things that you're trying to think about is your constraints and your affordances, and kind of create an environment where you can really kind of narrow in on solutions for things. When we move out of the office and into hybrid models or into fully remote models or something in the middle or whatever it is, we have new and interesting constraints to work with. And we need to design our operating models. So that's our structures, the flow of work through the system, how we govern the system, how we lead teams, how we measure teams. All of that stuff needs to be rethought around the constraints that remote or hybrid present. But further to that, philosophically, I don't think that big changes are a really good way to do things. So my preference is that rather than getting a top consultancy in every 5 years just to rip your business to shreds and see what comes out on the other side, that organizations are actually doing operating model design on cadence. So they're constantly looking at, all right, if strategy has changed here, what does that mean to the way that we organize, to the way that we govern, to the way that we measure? And let's make some small changes to align our operating model with strategy. My preference would be think about your new constraints, design something that fits your new constraints, and then iterate on that over time rather than doing something big and disruptive and ugly.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the point about how you constantly have to realign with the strategy. Oftentimes, it sounds really silly, but a lot of people think of organizational strategy as separate from business strategy, and it's not. There are no perfect organizations, right? There's only the organization that can help you accomplish your business goal. And there's of course, in the corporate world, there's a huge fear of like big reorgs. And I think what you're suggesting is rather, how can you become yourself an adaptive organization, right? And move to accommodate for the goal that you're trying to accomplish. And so I have a question kind of following up on that. When we talk with clients, and I'm sure you have the same conversations, I always say, like, I am no remote work evangelist. I'm not here to sort of convince you that remote work is the right approach, because I actually think that depending on your context, your business strategy, what you're trying to achieve, it might be that your work models need to evolve, but they just need to evolve towards something else. And I wonder what your thoughts are around, we've seen kind of the early, or even the innovators kind of say, we're going to be remote only, the GitLabs of this world. We've seen the early adopters saying work from anywhere, the Spotifys, the Twitters, the Facebooks. But we've also seen more conservative, let's say, or more traditional industries say, listen, I mean, I don't know about this work from anywhere thing, but let's try and figure out something hybrid. Do you think that there is a logic behind saying hybrid might be the right organization for our business strategy? What's your position on that?
Yeah, look, it's an amazing question. And there's a lot of angles you can look at that from. So first and foremost, there are some activities that you simply cannot do remotely. So you can't work with physical plant remotely unless you've got a robot that you're programming to do the work for you. You can't do surgery remotely without a robot with laser beams. You can't do there's a lot of service industry stuff, retail industry, hospitality, all that stuff requires people to be in the place where the work is. So that sort of eliminates remote as an option for parts of some workforces. I think then you need to look at the nature of the work. So in RAF, we talk about operations teams, product teams, and mission teams, where operations teams is an archetype for teams that are dealing with demand that just comes to them. So it's not really planned work. There's stuff that they have to do in response to the customer, and that means that they have to respond in a certain way. They might have a little bit of space to do some planned work, so some project-based work or something like that, but a lot of the stuff they're doing is maybe it's accounts payable or it's accounts receivable or that kind of thing. It's a lot harder to get an operational team working effectively, engaged and motivated than it is to get a team that is working on product development or software development or technology development or on some mad, crazy innovation mission. So I think you need to really think about the nature of the work that the teams are doing. You have to think about the people in the teams and the quality of the leadership and make sound decisions about what stuff is really going to suit the remote context and what stuff you might want to have a little bit more co-located or hybrid, I suppose.
There's a question from the audience, and I think it kind of joins this. So you've kind of told us about looking at, operational versus not, et cetera, teams. The question from the audience is, do we also see like a clear difference in industries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's an industry vertical aspect. I think it is the nature of the work, the competence and the engagement of the people and the leaders, and how the operating model is set up. If you've got a team that is simply taking orders and doing things repetitively over a day, and basically what they have to do is get through piecemeal work, they haven't got a particularly engaging leader, and they don't have a lot of autonomy about how they can go about things. It's going to be really hard for a person in that team to maintain engagement long term with your organization or with the people in their team. Repetitive, like if we go back to Dan Pink's stuff, and look, Dan Pink I think simplifies things a little, but the three characteristics of engaged people, you've got autonomy, mastery, and purpose. If you haven't created an environment where your people are getting some sense of that, they don't feel like they're learning, they don't feel like they have any control of their destiny, they don't feel like they've got any control of how they do things, it's going to be very difficult to motivate those people to work, to be as productive as they might be in a space where there's a bit of social connection and a bit of human connection. That said, a lot of the stuff that we do with the team launch patterns in RAF is about helping leaders to create that environment. So even if it is an operational team, giving that team a sense of ownership of the work, a sense of continuous improvement, building a learning culture in there so they feel like they're developing beyond just repetitive stuff. You can do those things if you launch those teams effectively, and if you lead those teams effectively, you can make them work in remote. But yeah, doing it without good leadership, good frameworks, good and competent people is going to be quite challenging.
Yeah, so actually, I did want us to discuss specifically the remote agility framework, and maybe for you to take a minute. I'm going to pull it up on the screen, but maybe you can take a minute to kind of explain those 3 levels of intervention and how you've designed it, and also how you run this work with your clients.
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk about this really quickly because I don't want to. I more enjoy talking to you, Marilyn. But effectively, it's about collectively 40 or 50 years of experience from the team. We've built the framework to tackle, first of all, the team challenge. How do you create highly engaged remote teams that have bounded autonomy, that have a sense of direction and purpose, that really connect with each other and understand who they're working with, and how they want to behave with each other? Like what are the behavioural standards that they'll accept? And we also build in that idea of getting a really good understanding of where the work comes from, how that work is dealt with, and how to continuously improve the way that we're doing things, so that you get that sense of achievement and that sense of moving forward that makes working in a team fun. So that's the team layer. In most organizations of any scale, you have to have teams of teams in order to do outcomes. So the next layer is about, okay, if you've got a bunch of remote teams, what are some of the challenges that you have? The first is the planning challenge. So how do I plan across multiple remote teams, really understand dependencies, understand risk, understand sequencing, and make sure that we have a viable, well-communicated plan that everyone can follow. Secondly, how do we build operating models or design operating models that are fit for the remote context and ensure that we've got small teams that have that bounded autonomy and that work can just flow through the system to customers. Finally, we've got the enterprise layer. So this is all the stuff about leading the enterprise, about governing the enterprise, about designing the flow of work through the enterprise and how you're going to measure things, how you shift from sort of output-based measurement to outcome-based measurement. How do you take strategy into planning? How do you look at the directional intent of the business? So it's just patterns to kind of cover all of the things that you would need to run a remote organization effectively. But we've also designed it knowing that companies do things the way they like to do things, so that you can just pull modules out. So if you want to just do a team launch a team. If you've got a planning challenge, use the planning pattern. If you want to just do your OKR cycle and take strategy into planning, then here's a nice approach for doing that brings people on the journey. And that's kind of the framework.
I was going to ask you, actually, can you walk us through what it looks like to run this exercise with the team? Maybe you want to take a specific example if your clients are comfortable with that. But just walk us through this process and just maybe give us a couple of stories so that we can connect more to the different approaches.
Yeah, sure. So a good example might be, because it's not an agile example at all. We're working with a mid-sized telco, sort of not first tier, sort of second tier in Melbourne. They had a major transformation program that was going to kind of touch a whole bunch of their systems. So a lot of legacy stuff, very expensive, high cost of ownership tech stack with customers on different platforms. You've heard the story before. It's just a bit of a mess. Doing a transformation program to move to a nice, shiny new tech stack that's going to solve all the problems like they always do. When COVID hit, they were 8 months into that program. They had a bunch of Gantt charts that were sitting on someone's PC somewhere and probably printed out in rooms. But there was no connection between the teams that were doing the work and the actual plans. And once people in the remote context, it was almost like panic stations, because there wasn't even the human connection between the people that had to do the work, because they'd sort of been distributing work out in work packages, yada, yada, yada. So what we did with that organization was bring everyone together in, first of all, a series of inception workshops to understand the work that the teams were supposed to do and get a handle on just how big the different initiatives were. And then bring all the teams together into a single workshop around a massive digital whiteboard, which kind of had people, 100 odd people working in different parts and bringing things together. But effectively, you had the whole program planning, looking at dependencies, jumping into breakout rooms, having conversations about how this thing was going to integrate here and what happened to happen, what would have to happen here. So at the end of that process, they had a greater level of fidelity and understanding of the actual status of the program than they'd ever had before. They had a really clear plan. Now, when we used to do big room planning in Agile teams, you'd walk to someone's building or a building that you were going to do the big room thing in, because you never had one in your location that was suitable for it. So you'd have to sort of lug all your facilitation stuff down, your texters and your big sheets of paper and all your stuff. And then at the end of the day, you'd have to try and find a way to bring all the artifacts that were created in the room back to the office so that you could then enter them into digital tools. At the end of that session, they had a program plan on a whiteboard that they could then gather around on a fortnightly basis and look at what was moving, what dependencies had been solved, where the risks were getting mitigated, and they actually had a program view that they now just basically use as the mechanism to run that. So that's what when we talk about virtual abayas in RAF, an abaya room is a lean concept, but it's basically a room with all the information that you need to make great decisions. This is like a digital version of that, and it lives and it's stable and you can back it up. It's so much easier than doing it in person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yesterday I attended a webinar by McKinsey where they were kind of discussing, resilience and which industries and which companies did well and which ones didn't, and what was the kind of the thinking behind it, and what is the commonality between everyone. And I think it was very interesting to see. I mean, of course, I think you and I have maybe spent a lot of our lives in these kinds of environments, but it was very interesting to see some of the words on those presentations, because it was essentially like, oh, we created more cross-functional teams, and oh, we shortened the decision-making cycle and created better communication channels so that everybody would have the same access to information. And of course, I mean, I say this without irony, like it's not like, oh, where have you guys been? But it's more like an interesting validation to say, like, it's fascinating to see now these kind of people having those same conversations. I often forget how recent, because I started working in 2009, so a full 8 years after the Agile Manifesto was written. By the time I discovered it 2 or 3 years later, I was like, oh my God, how have I not known about this? And then now, another 10 years later, it's always just interesting to see that there's a lot of this like practical, down to earth. I can't say that it's common sense because it's not so common, but there's a lot of these practices that feel like they should have been adopted in a sort of bigger way earlier. And it's just good to see that people are continuing to discover them and continuing to see the values in them.
Yeah, 100% agree. Look, Agile was always a community movement for me. It started off with people, like you look at what happened with Lean, you look at what happened with market-based management, you look at what happened with a lot of these management frameworks. They were pushed onto organizations. The beauty of Agile was always that it started in a lot of organizations just with people saying, look, I'm absolutely sick of working in a way that is completely incongruent with what I'm trying to achieve. There's this thing over here. Do you mind if I try it? And then it sort of builds momentum and it grows. Eventually, the antibodies in most systems kill it, so you have to do something top-down in order to sustain it. But there's really rich meetup communities. There was great conference communities, and that's for the last couple of decades. There's some wonderful, wonderful people doing some really cool stuff with great positive intent in the Agile community.
Yeah, I guess on that point, actually, interestingly enough, the way that Agile grew in that organization where I was working at the time was exactly that. It was like one developer, I was a project manager. He came up to me, he's like, listen, you should really learn about Agile. I'm like, sure, talk to me about it. And then he did. And I'm like, great, let's teach everybody how to do this. And then eventually it became what everybody did. We were a small enough company that we didn't have to then go back to the top, like the top and the bottom were very close to each other in that sense. I wonder actually on that point, if there are sort of some common pitfalls that when people are trying to kind of go towards these kinds of practices, there are things maybe you have to get out of the way before you can even begin. And if you have a couple that come to your mind.
Yeah, sure. I could wax lyrical about this for for an hour. One of the things I try and do with operating model design in RAF is really surface what is preventing us from working in the way that we want to work. So what you'll usually find is that the people in the teams, they just like, give us small cross-functional teams, give us something to do, and we'll do it. And then you manage the mess and the dependencies and that kind of stuff. We'll go to Scrum of Scrums. We'll do that stuff, but just give us the ability to work the way that we want to work. However, often you've got funding models that are completely at odds with Agile. So you've got a finance team that says, I need a business case that says exactly what we're going to get and exactly how much it's going to cost before we start doing anything. And then I'll give you the money. So that means that you can't build teams that are stable, that stick together. You have no real predictability at a management level about how to level your spend in order to meet things. So you're constantly trying to stack up and stand down capability as the business cases and the projects get approved and that kind of thing. So yeah, funding model's one. Second one's governance. If you've got governance frameworks that ask you to measure things in certain ways or report in certain ways or manage risk in certain ways that are incongruent with the way that you want your teams to work, you'll immediately see the friction. And then you've got to start creating these crazy roles. All they do is act as a translation service between the teams and the governance methods and practices in the business. So they're probably the two big ones. There's really not a lot to Agile. The third one would be leadership. Like, you need to have leaders who are comfortable with letting go of control. And like, that sounds like a great, what you said before, a developer from my team came up and said, I want to work in a different way. You're like, hey, let's do this. It sounds great. There are those sort of leaders aren't as common as you might like them to be. And there's a lot of people who really do hold on tightly to control of their people and how they do things. So yeah, they're probably the three for me.
Yeah. I mean, on your point about finances, I was having this conversation this week. I remember first class of statistics during my MBA. Essentially, the teacher teaches us about levels of confidence, you know, and he's like, listen, if you tell someone to give you a budget and they give you an exact number, fire them, because their ability to hit this number at 100% level of, or even 95% level of confidence is close to zero. And it was very fascinating to me that companies don't operate in ranges, right? Like, when is the last time that you looked back at your planning from a year ago and you got to exactly where you said you were going to be? And if you did, it's probably because your team could have overachieved, but they hit the number, so they stopped working, right? And so it's really fascinating to me that we haven't yet, and I see a lot of corporates, like some of our clients that work in, like, they're like an 8,000 person company. The global CEO kind of said that in a workshop to the CFO. He's like, don't panic, but I really think that this whole, like, giving you a yearly thing and reviewing it quarterly really wasn't the best way to handle the pandemic. And they've done a great job, you know, like, so they were doing well. They're one of the companies that did well in the last year, but still there was a beginning of a thought process around maybe we need to do our planning differently. And definitely the governance piece and the leadership piece, they all kind of intertwine, but it's all about how do we hold people to account on what they're going to deliver? And then how do we create the right context for them to do that? And essentially, you know, we like to say that often, get out of their way, because that's what the teams want. That's what individuals want. I also wanted to ask you about some of the kind of the best practices, like things, I don't want to say best practices, I hate that word, but let's say practices that you've observed or helped these teams implement that in your mind are some of, like, the shining stars, like you always go back to them because you really find that they have so much impact. And one of the questions from the audience, I feel it's connected to that. Maybe you can answer it sort of as a sub-chapter of that answer, which is, how do you measure team morale in a distributed agile team, and is it useful?
Yeah, sure. So look, maybe we'll just keep this focus at the team level. and I'll talk about some of in the team launch pattern. There's kind of 3 things that we do. So the first thing is build an alliance between the team members, and basically what that means is that the team has a clear sense of identity. I worked with a leadership team the other week. We've got these little story me cards where it's like a mini Facebook that you can create to share with your team members to tell them a little bit about yourself. One of the themes that came out of that was that everyone kind of liked animals, and a second theme was that there was a few photographers in the team, and 2 of them liked taking photos of sunsets, and 3 of them really liked Japan. So we came up with an identity for that team called Sunsets and Snow Monkeys. The snow monkeys, this cute little Japanese Macau or something, I think they're called. But that team now has an identity that's really tied into them as individuals. And we spent a lot of time working out what was the purpose of the team, how would they agree to be with each other, both in good times and also in the inevitable times when things get stressful and tough? What behaviours do they want to see? And the other thing we really like in the remote context is because you're suddenly in people's houses, like you might be in someone's rental house, or you might be in a house with their family. They might have a big extended family. Maybe they've got a cultural role in the house that means at times they need to prepare meals, or that they've got greater expectations about housework or looking after kids. You're not working with someone in a space that's managed. You're very much working with them in their space. So one of the big things that we like to do is help people to gently build empathy for the other team members' situations so that they can manage things like, do you want your camera off or on, or are there certain times that you want to work? Do we have to build a 9-to-5 schedule, or can we kind of work around bits that work for everyone? So if you want to go to the gym in the morning and I like to work late at night, then we can balance that out. So that's kind of that's the team alliance, and that's really critical. If you want a successful remote team, you have to spend time getting to know each other and working out who you're going to be together. Second thing is a system of work. So all teams have demand that comes in. They all have to do stuff to that demand, and then they have customers that consume outcomes. The ideal scenario is you've got demand that comes in and you can go straight into serving customers. But a lot of the time you've got to work through dependency chains in a system in order to get stuff out. So helping people to understand where they sit in an organizational dependency chain, what their role is, how work flows through the system, that's really critical. That helps us to build Kanban systems. Kanban systems are amazing for optimizing the flow of work through the team and through the organization. There we look at how we're going to measure our effectiveness, and what we ask teams to do is think about how they're going to measure and prove that they're improving over time, because you do get a kick out of finishing things. You also get a kick out of knowing that you're getting better as a team. And the final thing that we do is spend a lot of time on communication. So first and foremost, how are we going to communicate under different urgency profiles? So when do I pick up a phone? When do I send a Slack DM? When do I send a Slack message that I'm not expecting to get an immediate return from? Like, what tools am I going to use in the different contexts in order to be really clear about how I'm going to be communicating with people? And we also get teams to think about events. What we found at the start of the pandemic was that the Agile teams that we were working with just did exactly what they were doing before the pandemic in a Zoom call. And we're kind of like, hang on, the whole paradigm has shifted. So spend some time thinking about, what does a daily stand-up look like if you're not standing up around a whiteboard? What does a planning meeting look like if you've got all these fancy new tools to play with? Questions like that to kind of go, all right, well, how are we going to communicate? How are we going to be together? And how are we going to do these things differently now that we're in a remote context?
Thank you so much. I think that's like incredible advice. I could sit here and talk to you for another hour, but we're already past 40 minutes. I do know that a few people have stuck around, and I see their comments. So I'm very excited about that. Maybe we'll do a episode 2 at some point. But I have to kind of lead us, unfortunately, to our last question of the day, Andrew. It's a question we ask all of our guests. So please complete the following sentence and tell me why you choose the word or words that you choose. The sentence is, the future of work is ...
I'm on mute. The future of work is, I'm on mute. Look, of course I'm going to say the future of work is remote. I did pull up some stats out of Miro's latest report and out of another report I saw today. So in the US, on the average commuter who stayed at home for the pandemic has saved 8.2 days in the last year in transit. So they gained 8 days back in their life to do stuff that actually means something to them. We've got these awesome stats from the Miro report. Nearly half of people who are married or live in partnerships say that working from home has improved their relationship with their spouse or partner. 62% of parents with children under 18 say that working from home has improved their relationship with their kids. Over 1/3 of workers say that if their workplace makes remote work permanent, they are somewhat likely or very likely to move to a different place where to live where they'd like to live, rather than where they have to work. When we started to elaborate a decade ago, an Agile consultancy, we had this overriding purpose that if we could create really great organizations to work in that also delivered great shareholder outcomes, then we'd be making a big impact in the community. And there's some really lovely stories that have come out of that last decade of people coming up to us and saying, until you introduced Agile, I really dreaded going into work in the morning. And now this place feels like it feels alive. You add remote to that, not only can we make workplaces better, we can get people closer to their communities, closer to their families, closer to the places they want to be, their hobbies. We can build better communities. And we also have this awesome environmental benefit as well. We're cutting out transit. We're cutting out air transit, car transit, reducing the peak hour for everyone. And also, hopefully, if we have the right sort of policies around home energy use and making sure that companies don't just shift their responsibility for clean energy off the corporate balance sheet and to the individuals in their companies, then we have a really great opportunity to actually have a measurable impact on emissions, which is very, very cool. So, yeah, that's what we're chasing, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, I know how close sustainability is to your heart from our conversation. So I really wanted you to talk about that as well, although that could be a whole other episode, I'm sure. I really want to thank you, Andrew, for being such a wonderful guest and taking time late, it's past 10 p.m. for you to join us. Huge thank you to our attendees and everyone who tuned in and engaged. Of course, the video will be available on LinkedIn, and we'll repost it on social pages, YouTube, and our website. If you don't do so already, what are you doing? Follow Cosmic Centaurs on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or even subscribe to our newsletter by going to our website. I look forward to seeing all of you for our next episode next Thursday, March 18 at 2:30 p.m. Dubai time. We'll be joined by Rami Kahale. He's the CEO of joygifts.com, and we'll be talking about what it was like running and scaling an e-commerce business, how him and his team worked on reaching profitability, and how they're approaching their expansion into new markets, all in the middle of the pandemic. In the meantime, Andrew, thank you so very much for joining us. I truly enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to more conversations together. Thank you, everyone.